a rather obscure thing about the Erie Canal, Jeremiah Boerner's wheelbarrow. There was a wheelbarrow invented just to dig the canal. The guy lived in Rome. He was a big contractor between here and Utica and other places. And I find this website with a guy who's drawing in a computer this wheelbarrow. And I've been following along, and the artwork has continued to grow, and it is some of the most compelling Erie Canal imagery that I've seen, most specifically because there was no photographer when the original Erie Canal was built. Right? It's too old. There was not cameras, so there's no way to see some of this stuff, except through what Steve's going to talk about. So, and you live in Spencerport, which is out past Rochester? Yes. Please give us a hand for Steve.
See how this microphone works. Can you hear me? Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Patrick. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for having me here. I was just told that it's official now. The building is now on the National Registry. And just congratulations on your organization here. It just seems to be thriving. And it's wonderful to see a local historical society doing so well. So whatever it is you're doing, keep doing it. So my name is Steve Boerner, as Patrick said. I'm here to talk to you about some landscapes of the early Erie Canal that I've been working on for the past few years. And the pictures are made with 3D modeling and rendering software because, to be honest, I can't paint or draw worth a darn. But this amazing technology has given me a way to open up a window into the past. Now, it's not to say that the computer does all the work. Excuse me. Each picture can take months or even years to complete. Much of the time that I spend on the pictures is actually spent on research, because we want the view through the window to be as accurate as possible. And the questions I have mostly concern mundane matters, everyday life as it was experienced by people in the early 19th century. What did a packet boat really look like, a passenger boat in the Erie Canal? How were the horses harnessed? Who traveled on the boats? And what kind of clothing did they wear? Once the details are worked out, then the technical business of making the picture can begin. And today I'm hoping to give you an idea of how the process works. I'll try to be brief. I'm going to try to finish this presentation in 30 minutes, give or take. So please hold your questions till the end. We should have plenty of time then to answer any questions. History books, for the most part, don't concern themselves with the lives of everyday people, or how back in the day what everyday objects looked like, or how they worked. But those are the things I'm mostly concerned with. And as a result, most of my research has to depend on primary sources. Traditionally, primary sources means boxes of old documents. And actually, I found that this is a good place to start, even when doing research on visual history. And it means that I get to spend hours and hours going through boxes of old documents in various archives around New York State, something that I actually enjoy a lot. And I've had a lot of fun doing that the past few years. There's no substitute, and I'm sure some of you know this. There's no substitute for handling original source material. The old handwritten documents give us a physical connection to the people who lived 200 years ago. And reading their handwriting can put you in their shoes. You're physically in the same place they were when they wrote this out. So I've learned to take this part of the process very slowly, to handle the documents with care and respect, to take good notes, and to turn every page. You just never know what you're going to find. The New York State Archives at Albany has preserved thousands of documents from the original canal era. I mean, I don't know, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands. They have an enormous collection. This is a page from a ledger of canal contracts and shows the payments to a Lockport contractor named Darius Comstock. This can help sort out when and where he worked on the canal. And previous researchers have used the same information to calculate the number of workers needed on this section of the canal, and things like that. So you can draw a lot of information out of data that people basically wrote down in their ledgers 200 years ago. Personal and business letters can be good sources of information. Even details mentioned in passing can provide new information or confirm information that you find elsewhere. And if you look, you'll see that Darius is mentioned in this too. This is a recently discovered letter. It just came to light actually just a few months ago. And it was from a local doctor in Batavia writing to all the contractors in Lockport, complaining basically about the physical conditions, the unhealthful working conditions for the workers there on the deep cut. And so it really gives us a glimpse of what the working conditions were like there that we didn't have before. Back then, individuals and small businesses used a system called single entry bookkeeping to keep track of their expenses and debits. And it's more simple than the system that we use now if you're using QuickBooks or something like that. That's double entry bookkeeping. This was a little more simple, and it worked great for them. A lot of the payments that they made to each other back then were in kind, or in materials or something like that, instead of cash. Banking was very rudimentary on the frontier, which is what this area was 200 years ago. But again, if you go through documents like this, you can find little clues and glimpses of things that might confirm something that you think you know. And my rule of thumb, if I can, is to use two sources on every important piece of information. It's not always possible, but I do have a background in journalism. I worked at a newspaper for a long time, and the rule then was three sources, I think, before you could report a fact, and maybe that's kind of stuck with me. But I like to have confirmation of things that I read. So many documents are also have been scanned and are available online. The state archives, places like the state archives and the Library of Congress, have huge collections of scanned primary documents. Resources such as the Internet Archive and Google Books can be combed for documents published in the early 19th century. I spend a lot of time on Google Books. It's the place to go if you want to learn how to build a wooden arch bridge, harness a tandem horse team, or as shown here, how to measure and cut the material for a man's top coat. And of course, contemporary surveys and maps. I collect a lot of maps. I love maps to begin with. So that's something ever since I've been a kid. I've always loved to look at maps. So I collect as many old maps of the Erie Canal as I can find, and a lot of them have been digitized. The canal survey maps, this is one of the original canal, these were made in the 1830s, are among the most useful. But we have no photographs of the original Erie Canal, no contemporary photographs. The canal was built from 1817 to 1825. The daguerreotype would not be invented until 1839. Wet plate photography, which I believe is what people like Matthew Brady used during the Civil War, would not come along until 1851. So all of the construction in the original Erie Canal predates photography. We have to depend on things like engravings and lithographs and sketches, paintings, to show us what the canal looked like. And there's a big difference, because when you take a picture, you record everything in the frame, regardless of whether you meant to or not. The camera includes it. So you can often look at old photographs and learn things that the original photographer never intended to show you, or didn't think much of, like what kind of clothing did people wear, and what's that thing in the background, and things like that. With paintings and engravings, the only thing that's in the frame is what the artist intentionally decided to put there. So it's a very selective way of seeing, and you kind of have to keep that in mind. And another thing is that when it comes to the Erie Canal, there are actually very few contemporary pictures. Maybe a couple, 3 or 4 dozen that I know of, that I would say are accurate renderings. This is a picture of the aqueduct at Little Falls, and it was made by a man named James Ace. Back in 1825, he did a series of 4 engravings. You'll see another one here a little bit later, of different areas of the canal, for a book that was published in it. One of my favorite canal artists is a young man by the name of J.W. Hill. And he was, I think his pictures are actually the finest views that we have of the early canal. His father was a, I can't think of the word, engraver in New York City. He did a process that made color engravings. It was a relatively new process. And he wanted to have studies to base a book of pictures of the canal on. So he sent his son, who was only 19 years old at the time, across the state to make watercolor studies of different areas of the canal. I'm aware of 4 or 5 of his pictures. There probably are more out there. The book was never published. But his pictures are just beautiful, and they're almost photographic. I mean, because he was doing studies, he tried to include as much information as he could so that when the time came to make the lithographs or engravings, they could decide what to include and what not to include. This is another picture of the aqueduct in Little Falls. It's just a wealth of detail in this picture. It's just wonderful. And it's a nice painting besides. We also have personal drawings and sketches made by people who travel on the canal. And these are still coming to light, and probably there are more to be found in trunks and attics and places like that. I believe this set came to light in the 1980s, I believe. It's made by a man named, I have to look it up here, John Hopkins. And he traveled on the Erie Canal literally days after it opened in 1825. He passed through, it was the first week of November of 1825. He was an Episcopalian minister. He was traveling from New York City to Detroit to visit different churches. And so he took the Erie Canal and passed the time, the long hours, waiting on the packet boat deck, making sketches of the canal. And they're just wonderful, lots of nice detail. And again, this is Lockport. Lockport is one of those places that we have many pictures of because it was famous. It was very picturesque. The aqueduct was well known. It was kind of halfway, more or less, on the way. So tourists always look forward to approaching or arriving at Lockport. It was a big deal. Artwork created by other contemporary artists, even those far removed from New York, can give us a lot of valuable information. The detailed paintings of genre artists like George Caleb Bingham tell us a great deal about early 19th century people, the kind of clothing they wore, the kind of tools they used in their environments. Even though he was painting on the Missouri frontier, Bingham's subjects could very easily have been found on the Erie Canal. And you probably recognize this picture. You might. It gets reproduced a lot. It's called the Jolly Flatboatman. And I love this picture. And one of these days, if I ever have an opportunity, I'm going to work this into one of my pictures. So just an homage to George Caleb Bingham. Engineering drawings of the original canal are virtually non-existent. There were no mechanical engineers in early America, early 19th century America. There were not even any civil engineers. The engineers who built the Erie Canal were surveyors and judges and other people who learned on the job, literally learned on the job. The closest thing to a blueprint that I found is this scrap of paper from the New York State Archives. We wouldn't call this a blueprint today. It's the corner of a contract specification drawn up for a farm bridge to be built across the Erie Canal. And must have been good enough to show the builder, who was named William Billings, what kind of bridge to build. When you flip it over, what you find is that when the bridge was finished, the engineer came back to certify the bridge, tore off the corner of the map, of the diagram, and wrote out the certification on the back. So this tells you a couple of things. Paper was more valuable than the records, the original specifications. And the only reason this was preserved was because it was a financial record. They didn't save any of the drawings they made. So the ones that we did have just got discarded. So the builder was named William Billings. As I said, he was paid $100 to build this bridge. And I don't know if that he had to purchase the materials or not, or how often they had to do that. So he probably didn't make that much money. And this will look familiar to Patrick. As far as I can tell, proper engineering drawings began to appear after the Erie Canal was finished, or at the very end, and anybody, you can correct me on this if you're aware of it, or perhaps at the very end of the construction period, just because we didn't have the bureaucracy to create them. There were no mechanical engineers, there were no draftsmen. This is an example from the John B. Jervis collection at the library in Rome. It's not dated, it's not signed, so we don't know exactly who made it or when it was made. But it bears a striking resemblance to the aqueduct that I just showed you in the falls. In fact, the dimensions here, there is a scale of feet, match that aqueduct exactly. So my theory is that this is a drawing of that aqueduct that was made after it was completed. But otherwise, we just have no idea. But by now, at this point, when the canal was finished, we began to see a professional corps of engineers and draftsmen begin to appear. They were being trained, finally, places like Rensselaer in Troy and at West Point, which started a military engineering course, and they started teaching people how to do proper engineering plans and elevations. So, and then there's another thing. We have existing sections of canals that have survived. Once the Erie Canal was finished, the whole country was gripped by canal fever. They saw how much money was pouring into New York because of this canal, particularly New York City, and everybody wanted a piece of that. So in New York, they started constructing what are called lateral canals. These are the canals that branched off the Erie Canal and connected it to the Finger Lakes and to Carthage, New York, and the Black River Canal, and other places. And then Ohio started building canals, and Canada, the Welland Canal, of course, Pennsylvania. So they needed engineers, they needed draftsmen, and they got their canals built. Now the thing is, with some of those canals, the Ohio and Erie, for example, in Ohio, and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in Maryland were actually built by the same engineers who built the Erie. They were the same size, 40 feet wide, 28 feet at the bottom, 4 feet deep. And the locks and everything else followed suit. But unlike the Erie Canal, they were never enlarged. And the sections of those canals that survive can give us a real good idea of what the original Erie Canal looked like. So we actually have modern draftsmen's drawings, construction drawings of those canals. And this is an image from a collection called the Historic American Engineering Record, which was started after, I think, as part of the New Deal to give engineers something to do. And they were paid to go out and make proper engineering drawings of surviving historical structures. And among those are sections of the Ohio and Erie and the Chesapeake and Ohio canals. So we have actual blueprints, basically, of the structures of those canals, and they make wonderful references for the Erie Canal. And finally, there are the artifacts themselves. Most of the everyday items from the early 19th century have vanished without a trace. But some have survived in museum collections and can be found by searching their archives online. This top hat and fancy bonnet can be found among the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And it's important to remember when going through these collections, however, that they didn't save everyday clothing. They saved clothing that was worn by upper-class people. So people like you and me who would have worn homespun clothing, they didn't save that. So you just kind of have to keep that in mind. This Conestoga wagon is in the collection of the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. So lots of great stuff out there that's been saved. Archaeological research can also turn up examples every now and then of early 19th century objects. This Erie Canal packet boat was discovered in 2019, just 3 or 4 years ago, by the Seneca Lake Archaeological and Bathymetric Survey. It used submersible robots and side-scanning sonar to search for sunken boats at the bottom of Seneca Lake. So for the first time, literally, in 150 years, we get to see an actual Erie Canal packet boat. And we don't have to depend on paintings and drawings to know what they look like. So it really eliminates a lot of guesswork, and it's really exciting when something like this turns up. So, building the scenes. Everything and every object that you see in the landscapes is individually modeled. 3D modeling programs are used to make objects like buildings, bridges, and people. This is a model of an early Erie Canal freighter based on one of the boats that was found at the bottom of Seneca Lake. Specialized applications are used to create foliage, things like trees and grass and wildflowers. And other programs are used to make clothing, and you might recognize that line. Models of people and animals can be placed in different poses. And another program is used to create the stage, the virtual landscape that all the objects will be placed in. The models are placed in it, and a virtual camera is then used to take a picture of the scene and create a high-resolution rendering. In some ways, rendering the image is just like taking a photograph, except that here you have complete control over the vantage point and even the weather and the date and the time of day. So to give you an idea of how the process works, I thought we'd look at a specific project, making a landscape of the excavation of the deep cut near Lockport. But first, I'm going to have to put you through a little history here. By the fall of 1819, work in the Erie Canal had been going on for 2 years. The middle section, which extended from the Seneca River at Montezuma to the Mohawk River at Rome, was nearly complete. The canal commissioners made a good decision to start the canal here. It may seem a little odd to us that they started in the middle, but they had very good reasons for doing that. First of all, it was relatively flat, and the soil was easy to dig. So this section could be started and finished relatively quickly. They hoped that by doing this, they would build political support. If they could finish part of the canal and get it in working order, they could show people how profitable it could be, and that would increase the chances that they would get approval to finish the western and eastern sections. New York politics being what it is, they didn't approve the whole thing all at once. They just approved it chunk by chunk. And so they wanted to be sure that eventually they could connect Albany with Buffalo, so they started in the middle. And it actually turned out to be a good idea. When they did open the middle section, it proved that the canal would dramatically reduce shipping costs and become a money-making venture for New York State. But by focusing on the middle section, the commissioners had repeatedly put off selecting a route for the canal from Rochester to Buffalo. They had two options. They had done several surveys by now, and they had two options, a northern and a southern route. The southern option had the advantage of following established transportation routes, and it passed through areas that had already been settled. But there were two problems with this approach. The first was the high elevation of this part of the state. The canal would have to ascend to a height of about 75 feet above the surface of Lake Erie, and this would require the construction of several new locks, actually quite a few. More seriously, at that altitude, there were no reliable water sources to fill the canal. The northern route followed the coastal plain of Lake Ontario, skirting the northern edge of a geological feature that today we call the Niagara Escarpment. There were two problems with this one, too. First, at some point, the canal would have to cross the escarpment, which in those days was called the Mountain Ridge. Second, south of the ridge, the altitude of the surface in some places reached about 27 feet above the surface of Lake Erie. Now the whole plan for the western half of the canal depended on using Lake Erie as a water source. They wanted water from Lake Erie to flow downhill, virtually all the way to Montezuma. That's how they originally envisaged how this would work. So no part of the canal could rise above the level of Lake Erie without having to walk up and down. So this meant that in order to reach Lake Erie, they would have to dig a ditch that was 31 feet deep, 27 feet down to the surface of Lake Erie, plus another 4 feet for the depth of the canal. The canal commissioners selected the northern route, as we well know, and everybody got to work. The engineers chose a notch in the mountain ridge near 18 Mile Creek for the crossing point, and nearby property owners could not believe their good fortune. They immediately founded the village of Lockport and began to thrive and grow. Now you'll notice that Lockport does not appear on this map. This is 1821. So it's really kind of an instant village. You know, once they decided where the canal was going to cross the escarpment, that's where it appeared, because people knew that first of all, they were going to have to bring thousands of people there to build the canal. And secondly, when the locks were completed, you're going to have a lot of hungry and thirsty canalers coming through with time on their hands. So, you know, it would be a good place to set up a business. You'll notice that, and as it crossed the mountain ridge, the canal took a sharp turn south to connect with Tonawanda Creek. And they were going to canalize, they were going to rechannel Tonawanda Creek to carry the canal west to Buffalo. The mountain ridge would be surmounted by the famous flight of 5 paired locks. Has anyone here been to Lockport?
Yes.
It's well worth the visit. They have spent a lot of time and effort refurbishing. There is one flight of the locks that dates from the enlargement. So they're not these locks, they're not the original, but they're from the 1840s. But it's pretty nice, and they're doing a good job with it. Blasting out the locks from the face of the escarpment was hard enough, but more serious problems awaited at the summit. The top of the escarpment is capped with a thick layer of hard blue limestone that back in those days geologists called dolomite. This layer forms the ledge of Niagara Falls and of the High Falls in Rochester. After everything was staked, surveyed, and staked out, the engineers realized that this layer of rock lay only a few feet below the surface and extended directly across the path of the canal. But it was too late to alter the route of the canal. To make the connection between Lockport and Tonawanda Creek, they would have to chip their way through 4 miles of solid rock. Keep in mind that this was before the widespread adoption of steam power and before the invention of dynamite. All the work would have to be done by hand and horsepower, using picks, shovels, hand drills, and black powder, which was basically gunpowder. You may be familiar with this picture. It's one of the most commonly reproduced pictures of the early Erie Canal. It's called Process of Excavation, Lockport, and it shows the digging of the deep cut through the mountain ridge. It was drawn by a young artist named George Catlin, who later became very famous for his paintings of North American Indians. It may be the only contemporary image that we have that shows the construction of the original Erie Canal. It's very dramatic. The large horsepower cranes and huge rock piles dominate the scene. If you look closely, you can see crowds of men working at the bottom of the cut. Now try to imagine, put yourself in their shoes and try to imagine the working conditions there. You'd be excavating rock by hand with picks and shovels. Sledgehammers and handheld drills would be used to punch 2-foot deep holes in the rock, which would then be filled with gunpowder to blast the rock away. You would be paid $12 a month, provided with room and board, a not very satisfactory room and board, but a place to sleep, and a daily allowance of whiskey, up to 32 ounces. Seriously. Yeah, it's a lot of whiskey. It's a lot of whiskey. It was dangerous work, and the combination of long hours, poor training, and alcohol had predictable results. There were many injuries and some fatalities, with workers occasionally getting blown to bits. The deep cut took 4 years to complete. It was the last part of the canal to be finished, and it delayed opening by a year. As the magnitude of the job became apparent, the state took over from the private contractors who had been managing the work. Thousands of workers, many of them Irish immigrants, were hired or moved to the site from other parts of the canal. And I love this ad. If you read through it, I don't have a pointer, unfortunately, but down toward the bottom, they didn't have ad copywriters back in those days, but they were starting to get the hang of it. All young men and others who wish to be employed for high wages and prompt pay are requested to make a visit to this romantic place and engage in this important and interesting state work. So, yeah. The deep cut was finished in October 1825, just days before a boat by the name of the Seneca chief left Buffalo with DeWitt Clinton on board, along with a barrel of Lake Erie water to be emptied in New York Harbor. The cut would become one of the marvels of the early Erie Canal, and it was mentioned by travelers from all over, including tourists on their way to visit Niagara Falls. But the men who excavated the cut and their families would not be among those who were celebrated. By now, most of them were long gone, having moved on to work on canal projects in Canada and Ohio and elsewhere. So let's make a picture. Before starting on the landscape of the deep cut, I had 3 questions that needed to be answered. First, what were the dimensions of the cut? How big was it? Pretty basic. Second, how large were the piles of rocks excavated from the cut? And third, how did the cranes in Catlin's drawing really exist? And if they did, what did they really look like? We know the maximum depth of the canal was about 31 feet because this was mentioned in the reports that the canal commissioners sent to the state legislature. But they didn't mention the width. Fortunately, we have a detailed series of cross-sections of the cut created in the 1830s. These were used to calculate the additional amount of rock and soil that would have to be removed as part of the first enlargement of the canal. And this never ceases to amaze me, the difference between the approach to the first canal and the first enlargement, which was only 20 years later. The first canal was like they were making it up as they went along. And the second time, they had professional engineers and people going out, doing surveys, staking it out, taking measurements like this, so they could do precise calculations of the cost. We'd learned a thing or two. It really was an educational experience. But if you look at this cross-section, there's the original prism. That's the original canal. And this was taken from the highest point on the ridge, and you can see that it's a little over 32 feet deep, so that confirms the depth. It's a little over, almost 31 feet wide, and the towpath, which is that little notch on the right, which was also chipped out of solid rock, was almost 10 feet wide. So they weren't taking any more rock out than they absolutely had to. Boats then were 14 feet wide. So you've got 2 boats passing each other on this thing, which had to happen quite often because it was busy. So you would have 1 or 2 feet clearance. And not only that, but the mule teams and the horse teams had to pass each other on the towpath. So think about that. It had to be kind of crazy. So anyway, once we knew the size of the cut, it was possible to calculate the amount of rock that would have to be removed. I learned a little bit about excavation. I wasn't expecting to do that, but there are numbers that they use that tell you when you excavate this kind of rock, here's how big the pile will be. It's called swellage, because when you break up the rock, it takes up more space. So I found some nice information online. I was kind of able to calculate how big the pile would be, and it's nowhere near what they said. The original account said the piles approached 50 feet, but that's really big, and there's no need for the piles to be that large. If you take the maximum amount of rock that could be taken out, it would be a little under 30 feet. And the cranes weren't placed on the cut until very late in the excavation, 1824. So the piles would actually be smaller than that, I think. So when we started this project, my daughter and I explored this section of the canal by taking a bike ride from Lockport to Pendleton. And this is one of the joys of working on these pictures, that it gives me an excuse to go visit all these places. But unfortunately, the deepest parts of the cut can't be seen from the bike trail because it's all overgrown, like many parts of the Barge Canal are now, with secondary growth and undergrowth and that sort of thing. And actually, it's kind of dangerous to try to approach the edge because you can't see where it is, and it's still pretty steep. But the rock piles are still there. We found quite a few of those. Most of these probably date from the later enlargements. But I like to think that at the bottom of these piles, there's still a few stones left that were blasted from the cut in 1820. So what about those cranes? And this is the most fascinating part of that picture that I first showed you, George Catlin's drawing. They really are amazing, but he was an artist, so his drawing is very dramatic, but it doesn't contain a lot of detail. And I could find no references to them anywhere at first. So I wasn't quite sure they existed, but it turns out that the guy who's credited with inventing them, a guy by the name of Orange Dibble, love that name, from Niagara County, was awarded a patent in 1824 for an earth-moving machine, earth, stone, etc. removing. So he had a patent for a machine that would move earth. And then there are newspaper accounts. There aren't very many, there's just 3 or 4 that I could find. But they do mention, and again I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the bottom, that removing the rock as it is raised from the deep cutting of the canal through the ridge is in a great measure remedied by a new invented machine worked by horsepower. So now I've got 2 sources. So I've got George Catlin's drawing and I've got newspaper accounts. What I don't have is an engineer's drawing, something that really shows me how they were built. But I found one in, of all places, the archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society. So, this is such a cool drawing. And the reason it's in the Wisconsin Historical Society is because it was drawn by a man by the name of Increase Lapham. People had great names back in those days, didn't they? Increase Lapham. And he was a cartographer and scientist in Wisconsin. And he's actually kind of revered there because they say he's the first scientist in Wisconsin. When he was young, Increase, his father was a canal contractor. And he worked on canal contracts all over the place. In the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, he moved up to Erie Canal. They lived in Lyons for a while. They moved around a lot. Lived in Lyons, worked on the Rochester Aqueduct, moved to Lockport. And he was a little bit of a child prodigy. He was 13 at the time. He was very smart, quick with books, and so he started keeping books and helping with the engineering at that site. And he was a quick study and also very observant. And so he actually made this drawing after their family had moved to Louisville, Kentucky to work on the canal around the falls of the Ohio. Mr. Dibble's machine for hauling rocks, for raising rocks from the deep cut, or deep cuts. That's why it says Shippingsport at the top. That's where they were living in Kentucky. So I have an engineer's drawing. There's a lot of detail in this picture. The only thing I don't have is scale. But you can estimate that based on the width of the cut, and we know where the cranes were placed. So here's the model of Mr. Dibble's machine that I made based on Increase Lapham's drawing. So for the first time, I could actually visualize what those cranes looked like in George Catlin's lithograph. Now the funny thing is that Increase Lapham's drawing wasn't the only one that was made of these machines. And I actually came across this picture about 3 weeks ago in the archives of the Rochester Historical Society. It was in the back of a journal of an engineer by the name of John Fay, who worked on the western section of the Erie Canal during the first enlargement, and he worked on the enlargement of the deep cut. So they were still using those machines in the 1830s, and he drew a picture of it, and it's almost identical to the picture that was drawn by Increase Lapham, and I would doubt very much that he had seen the earlier reference. He may have, because actually Increase's picture was published at one point. But still, now I've got 3 sources, so I felt pretty good about that. Other details of the landscape are based on historical records and artifacts. Here's the wheelbarrow. Here's a test rendering of some of the tool models that were made for the scene, including the wheelbarrow, a crowbar, sledgehammer, pickaxe, hand drill, shovel, and a couple of 25-pound kegs of blasting powder. This is a special blend that was manufactured for blasting rock by the DuPont Corporation in Wilmington, Delaware. So when looking at this picture, it struck me that if you take out the blasting powder, the rest of the tools there would look very familiar to someone working on some kind of construction project in the Middle Ages. really hasn't changed that much. It was all men and horsepower. The scene required close to 100 models to represent the workers. Some of the models could be unique, like these two guys hauling a rock, but others could be duplicated, slightly altered, rotated into different positions. In the end, a few dozen models were enough to represent all the people working at the bottom of the canal. And in case you're wondering, here's how the hand drills were used. One man would hold the drill in position on the rock, and the second man whacked it with a big sledgehammer. Then it would be given a quarter of a turn and whacked again. Now, you keep doing this until the drill had pumped a hole 2 feet deep in the rock. Now, picture being this poor guy after the guy hauling the sledgehammer has been drinking bad whiskey all day. You know, I would not want to be in his shoes. It's just impossible to imagine how they do it. It just is. I can't imagine. Two models appearing in the foreground are meant to represent real people. The man on the left is none other than Darius Comstock, the main contractor for this section of the cut. He came from a Quaker family that moved to the Rochester area about 20 years before, and actually before the canal was finished, he would move on to Illinois. People did not stay put very often in those days. They always kept pushing west. The other man is Nathan Roberts. He was the principal engineer for the western section. He's got a top hat. The terrain is then created and all the models are added to make the final rendering. The next few slides will take us through the process used to create the scene. Now, this is done after the fact and is by far not this straightforward. There's a lot of back and forth. But it's a nice way to kind of picture all the different steps that are involved. Each scene is set up a little bit differently. Normally I start with a flat plane and kind of displace the terrain from there. But because of the dimensions of the cut and the rock piles, I decided to take a different approach and instead used what are called primitive shapes, cubes and planes and cones, to build up the basic underlying terrain of the scene. And then displacements are added to create the rocks and soil and the shale and the dolomite in the sides of the cut. And then color is added in clouds. And the clouds, I wanted this to be an overcast scene. Normally I like kind of blue skies, but overcast just to make it look a little more gritty and to open up the shadows a little bit. As all photographers know, if you have an overcast sky, you have more detail in the shadows. The foliage is added next. We have accounts. We know that this was dug through virgin forest. This was the wilderness back then in western New York. And there's actually one account that says it looked like a hurricane had gone through and blown up a gap through the trees. So then you had dust clouds and smoke. And finally all the models of the cranes and the people and the horses and all that stuff. So, this is, the date is June 15th, 1824. So real quickly, I know we're probably getting close to our limit here. If I could just talk briefly about the next project I'm working on. I'm working on a picture of the construction of an aqueduct across the Genesee River in Rochester. No part of this aqueduct has survived. It was replaced in the early 1840s as part of the first enlargement. So we have no photos and just a couple of contemporary pictures, like this engraving, again by James Ates. So I've spent the last year, I started about a year ago, learning about things like how masons built masonry arch bridges 200 years ago, and how flour mills were built and operated. The milling industry was just taking off in Rochester at that time. It's going to play a major part in the scene. But I need to know exactly where the mills were and when they were built. So I've been going through records like land records and letters to try to sort all that out. State records like contracts and receipts can help sort out the details of the aqueduct itself and canal construction. And of course I'm collecting as many maps as I can I'm hoping to wrap up most of the research by the end of the summer, and hopefully by this fall get started on the picture. So, and that is that. So thank you very much.